This book is validation of everything that I was saying back in the 80s, and now I have it on your authority. It's the real stuff.
There you
it's
go.
Not by Muhammad Ali. It's not by Malcolm X. It's by Roy Beck, who cannot pass for being black, who can never be accused of being anti-white folks.
Well, that's right. And you know, I would say something to back up on the you know, people not giving up. The stories, the 200-year story I tell is, of course, not something that I found from primary research. What I did is I read lots and lots of books in which this was a paragraph in a book or a page in a book, but it hasn't been pulled together to tell a whole narrative story. And when you see that what was happening to Frederick Douglass in the 1830s, how similar it is to today, how similar it is to what was happening to African Americans in the 1980s, and then in the early 1900s, to read how W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about the same thing you were just talking about, how they said, well, 10 years ago, the top jobs and the restaurants and the hotels, and you know, it was the same thing you were just talking about. It says they were African Americans.
Absolutely.
Just now they're Italians and this, that, and the other thing. You know, immigrants that have come in. What some people told me about reading the book is, it's not so much that any individual story is so shocking. It's so shocking that the same thing has happened over and over and over again. Yes. But here's the thing. What I hope is that African Americans, and you know, again, but I would hope that African Americans who feel like there's just no chance to sort of break out into the jobs market, is if they look at these stories and realize how hard it was for African Americans at these other parts of history, and you know, just the courage that it took to break through in those parts of history, and then to realize that every time the labor market tightened up, African Americans showed that they absolutely had the ability to compete. You know, there's W.E.B. Du Bois, again, mentioning him, about 8 years or 5 years after the 1924 Act, he said that perhaps the greatest thing that ever happened to the African American worker was the slowdown of bringing white workers from Europe. And the newspapers, African American newspapers, said, well, before they cut off immigration, the general attitude was there was just something almost biological about African Americans that they couldn't really succeed in the modern industrial society, right? I mean, it's that, but okay. But then they said, but then when the labor market tightened, and even though they'd been blocked from the industrial jobs for a half century, all of a sudden they were in the jobs and they flourished. So, you know, right now it just seems so silly to think about that. But, you know, there were these racial attitudes at the time that people just thought, well, I just think that there's just something that African Americans don't have. They can't do it. No, they could. They just didn't have a tight enough labor market. And so there's, throughout this history of this book, that's in this book, I think should be an encouragement, or I should say a discouragement from people to give up. And as you say, make excuses. On the other hand, my message to the general public, particularly to the white majority and to the 1/3 of Americans who have college degrees, is let's honor the work of the other 2/3 of all races, and let's stop making their life harder. Let's show some respect. And so we have a job. Those of us who have college degrees and are better off, we have a responsibility to take away that barrier. That's the message on the other side. While you're telling people don't give up and don't have excuses.
Well, people who listen to me are not going to give up. What has to happen is that all of us who have listening audiences must be singing the same song. And that's why it's important that Frederica Wilson, who is my congressperson, That's why it's important that all my state legislators, that's why it's important all of us who have influence and access to those who make decisions begin to have a consistency about what is the solution to the problems that we find ourselves dealing with in 2022. And for us to allow others to continue to manipulate us in their own self-interest as if it was still slavery time, when we know that it's all about economics, and we know that we're being used in that whole process, and we know that one of the greatest contributing factors still today is the irrational, make no sense, quote unquote, immigration laws in this country. And that is a platform that we ought to be speaking on with consistency. And I'm hoping that we can take your book as a launching pad to begin to document beyond a shadow of a doubt that it ain't about racism. It ain't about Black Lives Matter. It ain't about anything except the fact that we refuse to take advantage of this opportunity, which says very clearly that as long as you bring in all of these people and give them a work permit, they are going to step over us and keep on going, which means that we will stay at the bottom and we will come up with the excuse that it's all because they don't want us to advance. No, it's not. It's because we don't believe what's in your book. We don't dare to take what's in your book and challenge the system to do better. If we don't do that, then no one can complain about the future but us. And as we come out of this pandemic and we talk about workforce, and we talk about those who want to work and those who don't want to work, if you keep giving me stimulus checks, if you keep telling me that I can't go back to work because of the color of my skin, then the pandemic is not only going to kill us, but it will make us, quote unquote, unprepared to do anything else but be killed. So I hope that I can convince others that at the end of the day, there may be some racism, but the biggest thing I want to tackle is this immigration and how it's adversely impacting on the will to achieve and the ability for us to believe that it's about what we do, not about what they don't do.
I just have to say amen to that.
So you get ready to send me my books.
I will.
Sign them all so that I can give them out to the proper people with a similar kind of message and challenge them from Washington to the state's capital, to the city, to the county, to understand that as we come out of this pandemic, there's a new set of issues that we're going to have to deal with. And one of them is going to be the awesome impact that it's going to have on us as we prepare to try to go back to work. If I got millions of people who don't have a stimulus check, who now have permission to work in this great country called America, and that we're going to wait on our stimulus check, or we're going to believe that we don't need to go to school and get an education, because if we do, they're not going to give us a job, then the circumstances that we're dealing with now, today, would be worse than they've ever been. So your book lays the foundation, 200 years behind the 8 ball. Here's an opportunity. Here's the documentation, which says this is one of the solutions. And it would seem to me that those of us who know that this is true ought to become the voice and the advocate for others to believe that it is, and challenge them to do what they have to do in spite of what they think they cannot do. And if they don't do it, then it's time for us to think of another solution. Roy, it's always been good to be in your presence. And I want you to know that I've always enjoyed our conversation and would not be here now, but I feel bored because now I've got evidence that the stuff that I believe has been documented. And nobody,
that's a big point, isn't it?
It ain't none of mine. It was an outside, unbiased voice that put it in writing. And if you don't believe what's in here, and if you don't want to change and act because of what's in here, then the worst is going to be worse than it is today.